Oh, sorry, Yaritza for our next presentation.
Back to you, Kemit.
And back to me. Next, we'll have a good friend Kai from Horsley Witten in the U.S. Virgin Islands to speak to us about some work that's been ongoing on St. Croix. We're moving into our Ridge to Reef session. So, Kai, feel free to turn your camera on and take it away.
Testing, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for sharing such wonderful projects and backgrounds and bringing up so many great points that actually segue into some on-the-ground restoration that has happened in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. My name is Kynoch Reale-Monroe, or just Kai is fine. And my background is biology and water resources. I am currently a scientist with a consulting firm called Horsley Witten. I'm a long-term resident of the Virgin Islands. I have a love for this place and the people, and I have been working here for 17 years in all kinds of things, but teaching, research, nonprofit, and now with consulting on all kinds of projects related to Ridge to Reef. And I am very passionate about environmental and human health for the well-being of us all. And I am excited to share a little bit of a piece of success that happened here on St. Croix as a result of ongoing issues and sedimentation projects. Way back in 2011, the St. Croix East End Watershed Management Plan was developed. And in that plan is a whole bunch of places that were identified in the East End Marine Park, which is on the eastern end of St. Croix, that were all contributing sediment and different issues that potentially could affect our reefs out there. And in 2023, that plan was revisited and was reassessed, and many of the sites were reevaluated, and a new document summarizing that work was created called the St. Croix East End Watersheds Restoration Strategy. And these projects were all funded by NOAA, and I am very excited that this particular project fell in my lap because way back in 2009, my first restoration project was actually at Point Udall, or just south of Point Udall, Jack and Isaacs in East End Bay. I was a research hydrologist on that project, and there were trails, jeep roads that were contributing sediment onto the reef there. And that was restored and new trails were put in. And to this day, it's a beautiful hiking place for the community. Right down the road from there is another site called Whale Point, which had the same issue. And when the restoration strategy document was made, this project became a priority because it has been on the list for so long. And I am excited to report that we were able to push it forward and finally do something about an issue that we've known for so many years. And because of the interest of time, I'm only going to share the implementation of the restoration of this project, but really it was a huge community effort and there were so many people involved. But I really want to make a little shout out about how important it is to engage the community. And I'm really proud of this project because we worked with so many community agencies and people, and namely Chant and the Conservation Corps, who really were instrumental in implementing this project, which if you look at objectives, that would be objective 2. But I'm going to share with you objective 1. Thanks. Next slide. So the goal here was to reduce land-based sources of pollution at Whale Point. Next. And many of us met and tried to figure out what to do. But just for context, the whale point is in orange, and the location is on the east end of St. Croix. This is St. Croix. There's a East End Marine Park. It was the first designated marine protected area in the Virgin Islands. It's about 39,000 acres of marine habitat, and water quality data suggests that the major impairments of these areas are largely turbidity and nutrients. And Whale Point is another example of turbidity. Next. Some of the resources at Whale Point that make it even more spectacular than its viewscape is the resources. There are endangered and threatened coral species. There are turtle nesting. It has a lot of hawksbills and greens, but notably, I want to mention that hawksbills nest here a lot, and they are critically endangered. Next slide. And the problem here was sediment and physical destruction from vehicles. So this is an aerial photograph of the pull-off from the road on the east end. And if you look to the right, there's a road that used to be a walking trail. There used to be a guardrail. It was fell apart, removed, I don't know, but it has been used as a Jeep trail for years and years, and people drive down there where the turtles nest, and as you can see, the coral is very close right here, so sediment input into the fringing reef and all of the marine habitats there is very easily impacted. Next. So the goal was to address sediment here, and you can see here, this is the parking area. It's quite large. I think maybe 20 cars can cram all in there, and it was just a very large exposed area of sediment that can be directly discharged into the bay. Next. Next slide, please. This is the road where cars drive down into the bay. We were out there and happened to have cars driving down there while we were assessing the area. There's a sign there that says no motor vehicles, but you know. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So once we identified the problem, we moved into the design phase, and I'm going to share with you the process that happens to implement a restoration process. So first is getting it on a list and prioritizing, and then it is identifying the problem and figuring out solutions. And we all put our heads together in this design phase. But the goal was to reduce sediment entering the bay, provide pedestrian access to the beach, and to protect the beaches for sea turtle and coral reef habitat. Next, please. Next slide, please. Once we had our goals clearly defined and had met with enough people to develop a concept, we started the design, and I won't get into the technical stuff behind this, but it is actually a lot. The very first thing that happens is survey. Someone comes out and surveys the topography so that we can measure water flow and do all kinds of modeling and see what kind of slopes and what pitches and what affects what. So if you slant the parking lot this way, this much, how much flow goes that way, and what goes the other way. And there's a lot of behind the scenes calculations and considerations when designing a project. But this project, we wanted to reduce the footprint of the parking area. So we wanted to reduce the amount of sediment coming from the top. So that was goal number one. We decided on 6 parking spots, and we wanted to use a permeable parking lot where when the water hits it, it doesn't run off, that it runs through the parking lot. And if it were to fill up, then it would go into a area that would settle out, and before it would go into the natural gut and discharge. Once we all agreed on the design and the details, we then engaged the territory in permitting, which isn't the easiest thing to do. And when we were doing this, excitingly, the territory had just developed a new division of territorial, I might mess this up, protected area, territorial parks and protected areas. And which is a huge win for the territory. And this site became one of the properties that they acquired. And so while we were going through permitting, there were property changes and all kinds of things that were kind of complicated. But permitting is no joke, and you definitely want to provide a lot of time for that. Next. Along with the design, we wanted to restore vegetation that was native to the area. So we considered the trees and the shrubs and the cactus species and what ground cover to use out there, which went along in the design plan, which we engaged the community with, who came out and learned about native plants and why these native plants, and were actively engaged in those plantings. So that was exciting. Next. Once we had design and permitting done, we entered the construction phase. And this is where things really get exciting. Next, please. During the construction phase, we worked with a local company out of St. Thomas called Island Design, who specializes in permeable parking, among many other things. And they were a fabulous partner, and I'm really grateful to the work that they did out here. No project is ever perfect, but they did a pretty dang good job. But step 1 is in the top left. You got to prepare the surface and make sure sediment and disturbances don't run off the site. And this permeable parking lot has a gravel subbase, so that when water hits the parking lot, it goes down into the gravel and can hold up to 10 inches of water before anything runs off, which is pretty exciting. Next step. Next slide, please. These are some pictures of before and after of the parking area. You can see in the left where the footprint of the parking area is drastically reduced, and the idea there is to reduce impact and sediment disturbances leaving the site. That area was then planted with native plants that's still exposed. And then if you look to the left of the parking lot, there is a bioretention pond. And again, if the water hitting the parking lot, if there's enough water, more than 10 inches, which is a lot of rain, fills up, it will then run off into the bioretention to the left. And this is a special area that is able to catch pollutants and sediment and whatever is coming off cars and capture it there before it enters the natural gut and down into the bay. Next slide, please. This is just a before and after of the parking area. You can see the guardrail for reference on how, for scale, to see how much that area was reduced. Next slide, please. Next, yes, thank you. This is the road before and after. What I will point out, on the right, we used nature-based solutions and tried to minimize our impact and for erosion control. And in this particular situation, the goal was to slow down the velocity. Well, first it was to reduce the amount coming off from the top, and then to manage what was coming down directly on the trail. And we used water bars and check dams and bioretention at the bottom of the trail. So on the right, you can see the water bars. They have gravel and it's like a wooden bar. When water hits that, it slows down and then it goes into the natural, what's trying to make its own new gut there, which then has check dams in it, which slow down the water even more before it reaches the bottom into the bioretention, which is like the depression you can see at the bottom, so that it doesn't blow out the beach and it protects the beach from ruining turtle nesting sites. And as you can see, the reef is really close right there. So the entire goal is to reduce the amount of sediment entering that bay to protect the coral. Next slide, please. This is just an aerial video of the site. It's beautiful and a great place to come visit. People come here for Easter sunrise and New Year sunrise. That's a common place because the easternmost point, I think, of the United States is Point Udall, which is that point on the right. So very excited to have this area addressed. If you have any questions, I'm here. Come and visit.
Thank you, Kai. Next, we'll go into a presentation from a good colleague, Lisa Vandiver, who works with us here at NOAA's Restoration Center. Kai, I think we'll do the same as we did in previous session, where we'll have some time for questions for both of you guys at the end. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thanks for having us and allowing us this time to showcase some of our work in watershed restoration. I also just want to applaud the team for providing a platform for our youth. I don't know about y'all, but that was very heartwarming and really thankful for those strong women that presented earlier today. Just a really good taste of hope for the next generation. So thank you for what you're doing. So today I wanted to talk to y'all about some of the work that we've been doing to reduce land-based sources of pollution. So I'll give you kind of a broad brushstroke of NOAA's approach to watershed restoration in the Caribbean, and then I'll go into one of our examples in Puerto Rico, Culebra. So in Culebra, we were actually able to scale up watershed restoration to provide a measurable benefit to the coastal habitats So this has allowed us to learn a lot and to develop tools that we can transfer to other locations. So I'll give you access to those. In all, this work that I'll be presenting on is part of a collaborative effort spanning multiple partnerships over the last 10 years, namely Rob Ferguson, also with NOAA, with the Coral Program, Roberto Viqueira Rios, who was with Protectores de Cuencas, and Ann Kitchell with Horsley Witten, and Bernardo Vargas Angel, who is also with NOAA. Next slide. In Culebra in particular, there have been multiple partners that have helped fund and implement the work through the years. So I want to take a moment to thank them. Next slide. Central to this work is Roberto Viqueira of Protectores de Cuencas. His vision, dedication, and passion for protecting and restoring coastal habitats was key to the success of Culebra, which has honestly provided a model for watershed restoration throughout coral jurisdiction. So I'd like to use this presentation as an opportunity to celebrate his contributions to Culebra and beyond. Next slide. So land-based sources of pollution can pose a threat to our seagrass and coral reef habitats throughout the Caribbean. Pollutant stressors in the watershed, such as unsustainable coastal development or even sewer overflows, can become sources of sediment and nutrients. These pollutants can then be transported into the marine environment, either through non-point source runoff or direct discharge, and this exposes the nearby seagrass and corals to these pollutants. These pollutants can provide direct threats to these ecosystems, either through smothering them with sediments or even nutrients that can fuel the growth of algae that can outcompete corals. Next slide. So NOAA uses watershed restoration as a means of managing the threat that land-based sources of pollution poses to corals. Our standard approach is kind of a circular approach where we first start with watershed assessments. So this is both through desktop and in-field assessments where we go into the watershed and identify pollutant sources. From that, we can then prioritize and identify restoration that would give us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of reducing pollution to provide a benefit to corals. From there, we then prioritize of those projects, which ones we want to fund and implement. And as part of implementation, it's super important where we can to do monitoring. Sometimes you can get more money, other times you can just do like as built. Was the project installed as designed? But it's important to continue to assess those sites because that information directly informs future adaptations to how we are pursuing watershed restoration. So it's super important that part of that process, you review your outcomes, determine efficiencies, identify adaptive management strategies, and incorporate those and continue to, it's a circular process, so ideally you continue to come back to assess your watershed. Next slide. So in the Caribbean, there are several existing watershed management plans. These, I would not consider this comprehensive, but this is certainly a good snapshot of what is out there. And like I mentioned before, I'll be focusing on Culebra moving forward. Next slide. On Culebra, unpaved roads was identified as a primary source of sediment that was threatening the surrounding nearshore ecosystems. In fact, we found that the roads are producing 100 times more sediment than a natural hill slope. So this sediment, once in the water, is often resuspended with wind and storm events, resulting in chronic threats to corals. Next slide. So we conducted an inventory of the existing unpaved roads, and then we prioritized stabilization of those roads that were the greatest contributors of sediment to valuable nearshore ecosystems. So what we found is that there were, at the time, 50 miles of unpaved roads that were inventoried, and of those, 28 miles were prioritized for stabilization. Next slide. So before we could get to the work of stabilizing roads, we had to refine the technology. So early on, Protectores de Cuencas took a trip to St. John to learn about the technologies that the Coral Bay Community Council was using to stabilize unpaved roads. They then took these early ideas and tailored them to Culebra's conditions. So the techniques that were utilized ranged from road grading to check dams, to installation of sediment traps, cross swales, and even under drains. As the roads were stabilized, Protectores de Cuencas monitored them to identify adaptations needed to ensure that we got the biggest bang for the buck. So for example, what we learned was that in stabilizing a road that had 20% slope or greater, we really needed to use paving. Otherwise, the other alternatives required way too much maintenance. So all of these lessons learned were collected and summarized in an unpaved road standards manual that has been used to assist other jurisdictions throughout the nation to address this threat in their region. Next slide. So while building the technology is half the battle, Protectores de Cuencas integrated workforce development and training into all of its projects to build local capacity. In addition, being an isolated island, Protectores de Cuencas often had to ferry in materials and equipment to provide the infrastructure to support road stabilization projects. PDC's workforce development started slowly by linking local talent with opportunities and quickly expanded to partnering with the municipality of Culebra to training municipal staff on the new road standards. Eventually, residents of Culebra began to see that the roads built to these standards were more resilient to storms. So they actually started asking private contractors to build their roads to those standards. This type of paradigm shift is key to long-term sustainability of these stabilized roads. Next slide. Finally, and honestly most importantly, is the need to utilize these opportunities to promote stewardship within your community. I was particularly impressed with PDC's ability to use these projects as an opportunity to simply connect with communities throughout the life of these projects. In fact, when PDC began working on the unpaved roads on Culebra, homeowners were not a fan. Roberto worked very closely with neighboring homeowners to educate them about the practices, but also he would tweak the projects to make them more user-friendly. For example, he swapped out the cross swales with under drains to make the driving on the road easier, and it also in turn made maintenance easier. So today, we're seeing actually that homeowners contribute funding to support the stabilization and the maintenance of the roads as they see the benefit to the coastal ecosystem, but also to their daily commute. Next slide. Through all of this work, PDC has been able to stabilize over 32 miles of unpaved roads on the island, which has prevented over 300 dump trucks worth of sediment from being discharged into the ocean per year, which is just mind-boggling. Next slide. So work didn't stop at implementation. PDC saw that monitoring was a key to understanding the success and the opportunities for improvement. So we worked with them to build a ridge to reef monitoring program so that we could track changes in the pollutant stressors, pollutant exposure, and habitat response as the roads were being stabilized. The monitoring was guided by our management goals, and associated evaluation questions were established early on. Next slide. We then worked with a range of local, regional, and national subject matter experts to identify priority indicators for each of the evaluation questions. We then built out monitoring plans to measure each of the indicators at fixed stations across space. Monitoring included measurements of sediment accumulation along the stabilized roads, quantifying erosion and sediment runoff on road surfaces so we could actually parameterize watershed models. We also included measurements in the near shore, such as water quality and sediment accumulation at fixed stations. And then finally, at those same stations, we included measurements of seagrass health metrics. Next slide. So in total, what we've been able to discover is that through all of this work, like I mentioned before, over 32 miles have been stabilized. The total sediment load reduction is 3,900 metric tons per year, which is approximately 300 dump trucks. And across all the roads, the sediment retention efficiencies ranged from 25 to 90%, which is basically due to differences in slopes and things like that. In the near shore, we were able to collect over a year worth of water quality and sedimentation data. That information is helping us understand which of those indicators are most responsive to LBSP threats, which has allowed us to hone in on what could be the most cost-effective indicators to monitor long-term. Of course, water quality and sedimentation is dynamic, and it varied a lot by rainfall and wind, not surprising. In terms of the seagrass, we also were able to identify cost-effective indicators. And there was actually one location where we had essentially a pre-restoration, post-restoration survey. In that site, we actually saw that restoration site compared to control had significantly less macroalgae and epiphyte, suggesting that we might be seeing a trend that is related to the management practices that were implemented. Next slide. So in summary, the work out at Culebra has really helped provide a model for LBSP management. As I mentioned earlier, there's the unpaved road standards for Caribbean and Pacific Islands, which is available to all of us. We've also been able to quantify metrics for both stabilized and unstabilized roads, which can help us as natural resource managers understand the potential efficiency that we could gain for funding road stabilization. We do need, however, continued monitoring to better understand the scaling of road stabilization needed to elicit a habitat response. Lastly, the lessons learned here are being transferred throughout the U.S. coral jurisdictions, in particular the U.S. Virgin Islands is developing a water quality monitoring program that they've been basing off of the lessons learned in Culebra. Next slide. So in closing, I just again want to thank y'all for the opportunity to showcase this work. Special thanks to Protectores de Cuencas and Horsley Witten for their commitment to protecting and restoring reefs in the area. And most importantly to Roberto for his vision and passion that made this work possible and which we will continue to carry forward. There is a QR code here that takes you to the Culebra project site, and in the data and resources, you can access that unpaved road manual as well as many other resources. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa. We have about 7 minutes, and I'd like to invite both Lisa and Kai to keep cameras on and see if we have any questions from the group. I'm happy that we, notwithstanding the youth that spoke with us earlier, we're starting the rest of the coral restoration, coral conservation talk with the LBSP work, the land-based source of pollution. I know often we get excited about the coral farms, the coral nurseries, the outplanting the corals. That's the cool, the fun stuff, and I don't think everyone has the same appreciation for how much more successful that work will be if we do more around the land-based source of pollution issues across USVI and Puerto Rico. So thank you for sharing your thoughts in both spaces. And yeah, if you have any questions for Lisa or Kai, please feel free to toss those into chat or off of mute. But towards what I was just mentioning, what are your thoughts around, and I know that we've seen some proposals come in that have linked the coral and the watershed restoration work. What are your thoughts on that in general, and your advice to some of our partners that may be out there interested in the coral work and interested in, considering everything towards successful restoration projects?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I think it's great to think holistically about restoration in general, whatever that looks like for whatever space that you're in. And I think a theme that we're kind of hearing throughout everything that we've heard so far is the importance of connecting with communities. So I feel like the land-based sources of pollution absolutely should be thinking about that in tangent with your coral restoration, but something that land-based sources of pollution provides too is another unique way of connecting with communities and meeting them in their space. If they don't feel comfortable swimming and they can't support coral restoration, come plant a native plant with us. So it just gives another opportunity for communities to engage in our work.
I'll just second the importance of the watershed perspective on coral restoration. Many of the stressors are from the land, and you can restore all you want, but if you don't fix the source of the problem, those corals will continue to be impacted and the success will be less. So looking at watershed ridge to reef perspective is definitely important.
Thank you. Lisa, I have another question that just came into the chat, but also I was fortunate to be able to join you and a crew to visit Guanica and see a lot of the work from that Roberto and the team at PDC has done over the years, and was blown away because as a program officer, I get the reports and we go through those together and whatnot. But then when you're actually there and you drive in from site A to site B and you see just the miles and miles and miles of restored native vegetation and board trails and boardwalks, and is there anything that you want to share there about? I know the presentation was focused on Culebra, but anything that you want to share about all the work that's been done in Guanica, so that the audience our guests get a sense for how huge that work is or has been.
Yeah, and also I see Francis's question, so I can kind of get at that too. Because part of it is, how do you get municipalities to be supportive of these projects? And Roberto has been particularly creative and smart in this way. He and Kai, even your project, like a lot of times with the watershed restoration, you can build recreational elements into it. Because like the parking lot is a necessary thing, and a lot of mayors respond to those bringing recreational opportunities into their communities. So that's an easy way to kind of think about your project creatively, to apply just a couple tweaks here or there to engage the community and passive education, you know, of your work. And so I feel like the work in Guanica and Culebra, a lot of times you would see parking lots or you would see boardwalks, which would limit and delineate where foot traffic would go. But that's also seen from the community as, oh, look at this great boardwalk. Now I can access the beach in this way. Or now I have this great parking area. So I think that a lot of the work in Guanica really started to solidify how can we make these connections with the mayors, with the communities, and get that support.
Thank you, Lisa. We are at time, and we'll take a quick break for lunch, but wanted to say again, thank you so much to both of you for sharing the work that's been done both on St. Croix and Culebra and in Puerto Rico around reducing land-based source of pollution and the importance of that work in the bigger picture when it comes to coral reef restoration. So appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go ahead and take an hour lunch break. So we'll all meet back here at 1 and go over some more coral restoration presentations, and then a heat events panel, followed by the ESA Section 6 and 7 presentation, and then we'll end with the NOAA Line Offices panel. So see you all back at 1.
This conference will now be recorded.
It's okay. We can just like move forward. So yeah, for the afternoon, covering Jillian, she has audio challenges right now. But yeah, for the afternoon, we're gonna keep talking with about corals. We're gonna have. Oh, we can hear you now. No, it's fine.
We heard you for a second there, Jillian.
But it's okay. Let's just keep going. Let's keep moving forward. We're gonna, as you can see, the agenda is pretty packed for the afternoon. We have different sessions and new panels, but we're gonna pass it to Kemit for our next session, which is coral restoration before, during, and after.
Oh, you're muted, Kemit.
Yep. Can you guys hear me? Yes? Thumbs up.
Yes, yes.
Awesome. Welcome back, everyone. We have a beautiful afternoon planned for you as well. And we're going to kick the afternoon session off talking about coral reef restoration before, during, and after. So we're going to first hear from good friend Shay, who is with NCOS here at NOAA, to talk about the National Coral Reef Monitoring Program as a tool for restoration planning and monitoring. We're going to then hear from two restoration practitioners, one in Puerto Rico, one in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and then we'll close the session out with a conversation around structural complexity and reef-fish relationship. So Shay, take it away.
Thank you, Kemit. Hey everyone, great to be here. Next slide, please. I'll talk about coral restoration monitoring and the National Coral Reef Monitoring Program. So, as we'll hear from the later speakers this afternoon, coral restoration is increasing on reefs worldwide. This is largely in part to the decline of coral reefs worldwide, unfortunately. And the top figure shows back in 2020 how many restoration sites were across the globe, and then the bottom right is a focus in the Caribbean and a whole bunch of different management and monitoring, or management and restoration techniques. So with a whole host of different techniques, that brings into a lot of questions. Go ahead, next slide, please. Of what are the goals of all this restoration? So largely, this can differ by practitioner and by restoration project, but in general, many restoration goals include increasing coral populations and communities, increasing diversity, both at the coral level and at the reef level, increasing reef structural complexity, reef fish communities, and invertebrate communities. And the primary way to evaluate restoration progress from little outplants or degraded reef systems to some beautiful, hopefully not AI, reef system would be monitoring. And important parts of restoration monitoring design, you can't just go out and say, oh, we've outplanted 20 corals and how many are alive. You want to think about what it looked like before, what you want it to look like after, control sites, and what does the impact look like. Reference sites are super important. So how does your restoration change over time with reference to the unrestored community around it, and in a way to have statistical power to answer these questions. Next. You can skip this one because this is a duplicate, sorry. Next. One large-scale restoration goal in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is Mission Iconic Reefs. So this spans the entire Florida Keys Sanctuary and includes 7 iconic reefs, both offshore reefs, inshore reefs, and from spur and groove to patch reefs. This is a very, very large scale, I think the equivalent of 50 football fields. There are a number of practitioners and partners working on it. Next. Both on the restoration outplant and practitioner side and on the assessment and monitoring side, from water quality to wave attenuation to genetics as well. Next. So our question really with all of these efforts and all of these partners is, with all this restoration effort, how do restored reefs compare to the rest of the reefs in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary? And one way that we're doing this, next, is through looking at comparisons with the National Coral Reef Monitoring Program, which is a NOAA-led effort across all of U.S. jurisdictional reefs, from the Pacific on the left to the Atlantic and Caribbean, which include Flower Garden Banks, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Next. NCREMP has 3 big themes: tracking biological trends, tracking environmental conditions, and a socioeconomic component. And in each of these, there are different indicators or priorities. So I'll focus largely on the biological trends. So in the corals and benthics communities priority, we look at the change in coral diversity, distribution, abundance, size, and condition. And I think Jeremiah is going to talk later about the reef fish priority. So how does the fish diversity, distribution, abundance, and size change over time? And both of these include a habitat component. How does the composition, complexity, and key species change over time? I'll touch lightly on tracking environmental conditions through thermal stress, ocean acidification, ecological impacts, and given the time we have in this presentation, I won't touch on the socioeconomic component at all, which is largely driven by understanding the perceptions of the people and how they view the reefs in each of these areas. Next. So the biological component, which includes both corals and benthic communities and reef fish, is to characterize the status and trends of reef corals and benthic communities, as well as reef fish population communities over time in each of these jurisdictions. This program is geographically comprehensive, has a statistically rigorous design, importantly uses standardized, consistent, and comparable methods. We deliver data, products, and tools, and support local partnerships. Next. Specifically focusing on Florida, because that's where Mission Iconic Reefs is for this presentation, is showing the surveys from Florida from 2024. We sample in Florida every 2 years and are just starting surveys there for 2026. So there were between 500 and something and over 1,000 surveys from the Dry Tortugas to Martin County, and thousands of dives and tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands corals and fish surveyed. You can see the extent of it on the right. Next. So much like Iconic Reefs, NCRIMP has a huge number of local partners. Many of these partners in Florida, as well as in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, are also restoration practitioners. So there are ties together here as well. Neither of these programs could be done without these local partnerships. Next. At Iconic Reefs in 2022 and 2024, and we're planning this for June in 2026, we survey a subset of sites, about 100 sites per year, within the Iconic Reefs footprint. So these are consistent methods with the rest of NCRIMP, and survey demographics, benthic communities, structural complexity, fish populations, and communities using both a diver-based surveys, which is standard for NCRIMP, as well as imagery collection. Next. And because of this time series, we're able to show changes over time, as you can see from the Acropolis cervicornis data to the right, within the Iconic Reefs in blue compared to the rest of the Keys area in red. And it also captured the changes of populations that we saw, particularly for Acropolis cervicornis and palmata, two of the majorly outplanted coral species from the fourth global coral bleaching event, which impacted the Keys very heavily in 2023. Next. We can also look at changes in the coral reef community by individual species. And again, these show declines between 2022 and 2024 due to the bleaching event, both in the wider Keys reef community as well as specifically in the restored communities. Next. At Iconic Reef specifically, we also collect large area imagery, also known as structure for motion or photogrammetry, within these restoration sites at the stratified random design and crimp sites. This is complementary to the fixed site LAI collected by the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and just to show change over time, as well as practitioners within their own restoration areas. So this allows us to zoom in on specific corals. This happens to be a particularly unimpressive unrestored site, but look at how those areas might change with restoration into the future. Next. So this is Carey's Fort Reef, which every single one of the pink and orange dots show either NCRIMP sites where LAI was collected or fixed monitoring sites where imagery was also collected by the Iconic Reefs effort. Next. And the fish surveys of NCRIMP, which I won't go into too much, Jeremiah may go into it more in his presentation, also can show the comparisons between the Iconic Reefs in the blue and outside the Keys areas in the green, and the the data report show an ability to filter through a number of indicator species of interest, and also to look at differences between 2022 and 2024. Next. N-Crimp Environmental has fixed sites. Play, please. And this is one at Chica Rocks, so we'll zoom in. It's going to be a little choppy because of the go-to meeting. We'll zoom into Chica Rocks, where N-Crimp Environmental has a long-term monitoring site. And one of those has a number of time series, both before and after the bleaching event of 2015. And so we can see at this fixed site from imagery the change over time, which is a little pixelated here. Sorry about that. But I'll look at individual corals and pull out growth rates, as well as specific mortality rates from events. Next. If you're interested in N-Crimp data for your coral reef restoration area, there is a website which has all sorts of more information on it. The code and data are available via GitHub as well, specifically to the US Caribbean and for each geographic area. Next. We also produce summary reports from each jurisdiction that we visit. Here is at the top here, we have Florida from 2020, 2021, since that was an unusual year due to COVID, 2022, and 2024, which should be coming out any day now. And these were rolled up in, I think, 2020 to a larger status report for each jurisdiction. This example here shows Florida of the status of the reef, including corals and fish and environmental indicators, as well as socioeconomics, and that too is rolled up to a U.S. status report. I believe there's maybe another effort to update this underway within the next few years for these status reports. Next. So if you'd like to know more about N-Crimp, you're welcome to contact me. I'm the Benthics lead for the U.S. Atlantic. You can contact Jay Grove, who's the fish lead, Ian Enox, who's the environmental lead, or Erica Toll, the CRCP N-Crimp coordinator for Coral Reef Conservation Program. Sorry about that. Katie Lesneski is the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary Iconic Reefs monitoring lead. So you're welcome to contact any of us with further questions. And I also want to say that the work shown here is, again, the results from partnerships from many, many local organizations. Thank you all if you're one of those. And if you're not but want to be, please reach out to us. And also many, many people within all of NOAA. So thank you very much.
Now we're going to hear from Marilyn Brandt from the University of the Virgin Islands to share some of the tool techniques and innovation for restoring U.S. Virgin Islands reefs.
Hi. Okay, can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Thanks. Well, thank you for having me. Yes, I'm here to talk about tools, techniques, and innovation from the USVI. And as Kemit mentioned, my name is Marilyn Brandt. I'm a research professor at the University of the Virgin Islands, and I'm also director of Reef Response. Next slide. And I think, yeah. So Reef Response is the coral restoration program at UVI. That's the name of it. Next slide. And I just want to point out that I may be representing Reef Response here, but I'm representing a large number of folks who contribute to the work of Reef Response. So we have several full-time staff, as well as a postdoc, Dr. Acacia Halliday-Isaac. But we also do quite a lot of the work with the help of master's students in our MMES program, as well as undergraduate students who work with us year-round, as well as summer interns. Next slide. So we do restoration at several sites around the northern U.S. Virgin Islands, which includes St. Thomas and St. John, but one of the sites that we've been doing a lot of the sort of innovative work is a site called Flat Key, which is a territorial priority coral reef restoration site. This was a site prioritized in the U.S. Virgin Islands Coral Reef Restoration Plan that came out in 2023. Next slide. The site is located on the southwest of St. Thomas. You can see St. Thomas on the upper left there. The University of Virgin Islands campus, St. Thomas campus, is actually located quite close to Flat Key. You can see a close-up of Flat Key. So it consists actually of two small islands surrounded by a lot of diverse coral reef habitats. And this site is a popular dive site, as well as, because of its proximity to UVI, a site where we do a lot of dive training and scientific dive training. It's also the location for one of our coral nurseries, which was actually one of the first coral nurseries established in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Next slide. So in the Coral Restoration Plan, it designates the kind of coral restorable area for the coral reef habitat surrounding Flat Key. So that the colored images you'll see here, or the colored areas, are different types of coral reef habitat. And then the table shows the estimated number of corals needed to reach 10-year restoration targets for Flat Key. This site is actually the second largest in the Coral Reef Restoration Plan for the USVI in terms of restorable area. So there's quite a lot of habitat. Next slide. So we are focusing on two specific areas that correspond to 3 different habitats. Next slide. So the first habitat here on the left is called bedrock. So that's colonized bedrock. And then on the right is a kind of a transition zone between the reef crest and the spur and groove. Next slide. So in terms of the title of the session, I'm going to give you a little bit of the before. So the Flat Key bedrock zone on that west side before 2019 was an incredibly diverse area, and it was actually dominated by a really abundant population of Dendrogyra cylindrus, the pillar coral that's now endangered. Next slide. And on the east side, that transition zone between the spur and groove and reef crest, the reef crest was dominated by a pretty large population of Acropora palmata, as well as Acropora cervicornis and prolifera. And then the spur and groove was dominated by Orbicella annularis, but a lot of other diverse species. And that spur and groove transitioned also into habitat for Dendrogyra. Next slide. Unfortunately, there's like a little lag. In 2019, stony coral tissue loss disease emerged in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and actually the first site that we saw it was at Flat Key, and that disease spread pretty rapidly. It burned very hot there and actually removed almost all of the Dendrogyra from that bedrock habitat, and really impacted the coral community, removing other rare species. Next slide. And then the onslaught didn't stop there. In 2023 and 2024, so stony coral tissue loss disease does not affect the acroporids, but unfortunately 2023, 2024, the U.S. Virgin Islands had back-to-back mass bleaching events, so unprecedented thermal stress, up to 19-degree heating weeks in 2023, which had never been seen before in recorded time, or in records, followed in 2024 by exceeding that record up to 22-degree heating weeks. And so this really, in 24, really hurt the acropora populations. Next slide. So these are some pictures of Flat Key today. So even in less than a decade, we've seen enormous changes at the site, really a loss of a lot of diversity and color. So this is why Flat Key is a priority for us. And I just want to point out that the numbers for the Flat Key restoration site were calculated prior to the 2023-2024 mass bleaching events. So those targets are actually low based on for reaching the 10-year restoration goals. Next slide. So we had received some funding from the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation to work at Flat Key, and we focused on that bedrock habitat in the yellow box there, and this was led by the staff I have listed at the top. We focused on outplanting some of the bouldering corals, including Orbicella, which you'll see the 3 Orbicella species which are here. Between 2024 and 2025, we outplanted several hundred corals. Next slide. And one of the tools we've been using to monitor that the outplant survival and growth has been photomosaics. So a lot of folks are moving to using this. It does take some specialized equipment in some cases if you really want detailed images, but you can also, I think, just do it with GoPros. We do have a nice camera for this. And so we have these 10 by 10 meter plots for outplanting that we do photomosaics on before and after outplanting, and we can track periodically after outplanting, we can track growth. And for the Orbicella, for these arrays of microfragments, we can also track fusion of the arrays. Next slide. Also part of that funding with the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, we were funded to increase our toolkit by doing coral reproduction work. Unfortunately, for 2 years following the bleaching events, we did not have corals spawn that we were monitoring, but thankfully last year we did get coral spawning from Orbicella franksi. We had successful fertilization. Next slide. That resulted in a whole bunch of babies settling on some of the tiles and sea coral stars that we had. And so we recently outplanted those also to flat key. Next slide. We are about to increase our ability for coral reproduction work as also part of that National Marine Sanctuary Foundation grant and the National Park Service. We've been outfitting a container, and by we, I mean Davis and Jason on my staff. I've been outfitting a container to use our flow-through seawater system at UVI to create a spawning induction system. So this is where we're going to replicate kind of those cues that you see in the diagram to induce corals to spawn. Next slide. And we're going to be doing this with some species that we've been working with for a while, but ultimately with the hopes of moving in our larger colonies from our gene bank of Dendrogyra. So we have a large collection of Dendrogyra fragments. That collection was led by Mariah Sevier and Sam Gittins Jr. And so the ultimate goal is to get these guys spawning in the containers because we haven't had good success in our seawater system yet. Next slide. So the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation and National Park Service funding have ended, but we were recently funded by the NOAA Transformational Habitat Program to continue restoration at Flat Key, but also combine it with several other activities. So this project's called CMR3, or Coral and Mangrove Restoration for Resilience and Workforce Readiness. And the goal is to build ecosystem and community resilience in the USVI. So we have 3 project aims, including coral restoration at Flat Key, but we are also working with the Mangrove Lab at UVI to do mangrove restoration, and then importantly, community engagement and workforce training. Next slide. And so as part of the coral restoration work in CMR3, we're actually bringing innovation to our coral restoration activities by partnering with some folks at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, including Dr. Amy April, who works on biofilms, Colleen Hansel, who works on chemical supplements, and then Erin Mooney, who works on acoustic enrichment or soundscapes. Next slide. So with Amy, she works on harnessing natural biofilms, beneficial biofilms to enhance coral health. And so she's been working with my student, Chloe Camacho, to develop biofilms from a range of different coral reef sites that will help to benefit the coral health or the health of the corals that we're either outplanting or that we're attempting to settle. Next slide. We're also working with Colleen Hansel, who's a chemist at Woods Hole. She has developed trace metal supplements that provide thermal tolerance to the corals and also boost their growth and settlement. So on the graph, that's actually measurements of photosymbiont health after microfragmentation under thermal stress. And so the ones that are supplemented are in green, so they're doing much better. We've incorporated some of these activities into tiles that we're settling little babies on. And so we had a really successful Diploria labyrinthiformis spawning season that Jillian helped lead. And we have lots of little babies on some of these tiles. You can see sort of the little jello blobs on there. So we're excited to see how these guys do during the upcoming thermal stress season. Next slide. And we've also been working with Erin Mooney, who works on soundscapes. And so he's developed a system called the Reef Acoustic Playback System, or RAPS, which is basically an underwater speaker that plays the sounds of healthy reefs. So he's found that significantly more settlement, even up to 700% more settlement, coral settlement happens on these acoustically enriched reefs. And so we are deploying these RAPS units. Next slide. At Flat Key, we're just encountered a little bit of a battery issue, but they should be out in time for the remaining spawning season. We tested these RAPS at our artificial reef, and so we have been working with them for quite some time. So we're excited to put them out and hopefully get some increased coral settlement at Flat Key. Next slide. That's sort of some of the innovation and tools we've been incorporating into coral restoration activities, but I think this has been a theme across some of the sessions earlier, is that we don't want to do this work in a vacuum. It's really important to engage the community and increase coral reef stewardship, or else some of this work will not be effective in the long term. So we do kind of the traditional education and community engagement that includes, tabling and working and talking to the community about what we do at 10 to 12 community events per year. Next slide. But we've also been doing some innovative work with community engagement. So this past spring, we launched the Corals in the Classroom program, and this was the focus of Khalifa Powell's Master of Professional Science project, where we developed 4 classroom lesson plans and lessons with teachers at the local high school, so Charlotte Amalie High School, which is a public school. And we developed these lessons focused on corals, but also coral restoration. And each lesson had an activity. So you can see in the upper right here that we used some of the photo mosaics that we had, printed them out on cloth, and had the students do an activity where they actually had to kind of diagnose the reef with issues. So maybe it had too much disease or a lot of macroalgae, and then the students had to prescribe something for the reef to improve its health. So if it was too much algae, maybe add or protect from fishing and add parrotfish back to the system. And then we took these students on a field trip to the Marine Science Center. That's in the center photo, in the bottom center photo, where they actually got to see the corals and interact with the corals. And for some of these students, this was the first field trip that they had ever taken, even though they were in high school. Next slide. And so that kind of gives students an introduction to corals and the importance of corals and coral restoration. You heard from some of the youth ocean explorers earlier today. That was really inspiring conversations. That's also a great introductory program. And so as part of the CMR3 project and the NSF Strong Coast project that we have, we're enhancing the Youth Ocean Explorers program by adding an extra week for some of the advanced students to get job training in restoration. So they do 2 days with the Coral Lab, learning coral restoration techniques. And then they do 2 days with the Mangrove Lab, learning mangrove restoration. And then the final day, we go to Hull Bay, where we have a coral outplanting and a mangrove outplanting site, and they do outplanting of both of those organisms there. And so this is a great way for students to get kind of the next step. So they get the introduction with corals in the classroom, Youth Ocean Explorers, you get even deeper. This restoration ecology module, you get on the job training. And this type of pathway system is really important for giving the next steps to students, islanders who would like to be in marine science or in things like coral restoration. Next slide. And just as an example, Kadisha Tong was one of our Youth Ocean Explorers. She then became one of my undergraduate interns as an undergraduate at UVI. And she actually got up to the point of doing her own project, testing coral stress hardening for Orbicella and Acropora. And I'm happy to say she graduated a couple of weeks ago with a marine biology degree and is entering the master's program in the fall to continue this project and to see it where it takes her. So I think having these types of pathways are innovative tools to making sure our coral restoration activities are effective, because restoration is just not going to be effective if there's no stewardship in the communities where we're working. Next slide. And so with that, thanks for the opportunity to talk about our work, and I'm happy to connect later. Thanks.
Thank you, Marilyn. Next, we'll hear from Manuel Nieves from SeaVentures, who will tell us a little bit about their tools, techniques, and innovation in Puerto Rico.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, see.
Yes. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Kemit, for the introduction. Go ahead and click next. Well, SeaVentures has been involved in both proactive and reactive restoration strategies since 2006. When I talk about proactive strategies, I'm talking specifically about dealing directly with growing corals, and in more recent years, growing sea urchins and crabs, microx crabs that help us maintain and keep the health in the coral restoration projects. When we talk about reactive restoration, it's more about reacting to physical impacts that can happen on the reef. This can happen because of vessel impacts, vessel grounding, storms, and in recent years in Puerto Rico, we also had earthquakes. So those are some of the events that take us out into the reef to check out what the damage is like. And from these reactive activities, we've responded to over 160 sites and reattached over 70,000 corals across the islands. Next. For salvage support, one of the tasks that we perform can be as simple as offering alternative removal paths for the vessel. So companies can have an idea of what's easiest for them to remove the vessel. But if we swim around the area, we find that there's some corals that are at risk. We can just provide an alternative path that the companies can take. And if that's not possible, and if there are corals that have a high chance of being further impacted, we will physically remove these corals, allow the salvage operation to continue, and then go back to the area and reattach the corals to where they were initially were. Next. And as you might think, whenever these ship groundings happen, a lot of rubble is gonna be created. Rubble can also be created through natural processes like bioerosion or storm events. And before you even think about reattaching corals to your area, you need to make sure that the area is adequate to keep these corals on the long term growing on their own and not have any more threats. Rubble, when it starts moving around during high energy events, it can start pretty much flattening an area and bulldozing an area. So it's very important to either remove this rubble from the area or fix it in place and make sure that it's not going to damage your reef. This is a task that can be as simple as reattaching a couple of fragments, or in more extreme cases, it can be a huge effort. If you look at the picture on your right, there was an impact zone of a huge barge a couple of years back. And that barge, it took a while. It was so big, it took a while to take it out, and it literally flattened out the entire area. There was no three-dimensional structure in the place. So we literally had to bring limestone boulders of different sizes just to restore some of that three-dimensional space so that then we could start bringing in hard corals, soft corals, sponges. We were actually growing soft corals on PVC trees because, again, everything in this area was decimated. So your rubble stabilization would really depend on the specific site. Next. So once you stabilize your rubble, once you identify that your site is adequate for planting, then you can start going out and collect your corals, which can come from different sources. We try to source the majority of our corals from cuttings. So when we talk about cuttings, we're talking about little fragments from already growing species that could be palmaras that we outplanted in previous years or naturally growing palmaras, though we do try to prioritize harvesting cuttings from previously outplanted colonies. When we harvest, we try not to take fragments that are much larger than 20 centimeters. So 10 to 20 centimeters is like the average of what we try to take. And we try not to harvest more than 33% of the colony to leave as much as we can untouched. And a lot of our projects, around 55, even more than 55% of the corals that we outplant to a site come directly from cuttings. Next. Another source where we get our corals from are the microfragments that are currently being produced in land-based nurseries by ICER in La Parguera in the south coast and in Ceiba in the east coast. Microfragmenting has been a revolution in helping coral restoration projects because it expanded the inventory of species that we can work with in these restoration projects. Especially, it allowed us to start incorporating species that are famous for their slow growth. Microfragmenting allows for species that could take decades to reach an adult, mature size, sexually reproductive adult. You can accelerate that process to a couple of months, maybe a few years instead of decades again. So we do support continuous efforts in microfragmenting to complement a lot of the restoration efforts that are happening throughout the world. Next. And last but not least, we also perform what we call our coral rescue. You can go ahead and click 2 more times. There's some text that's going to appear. Some of the areas that we visit are the artificial structures like abandoned piers and docks. The picture on the left shows the Ceiba dry dock in the Roosevelt Roads Naval Base. This dock was abandoned, I think, around the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. So a lot of corals have been growing there uninterrupted for many, many years. You can see very large colonies of orbicelids, Montastra cavernosa. It's a pretty cool site to dive. And again, since these are considered at risk, it's one of the areas that we can go and collect some of these corals to complement our projects. We have also identified natural thickets around the island that we visit whenever we have huge storms, hurricanes, or high wave energy events, and we collect storm fragments. So although fragmenting is a natural process of corals, well, they break down and they will reattach and continue growing. A lot of these corals, if they do not become reattached on time, they will eventually die or they will become too stressed to survive in the long run. So after these events, we get our crew together and visit some of these sites to hopefully rescue some of the corals. Next. 2 groups that have gained attention in the last couple of years have been Dendrogyra cylindrus, the pillar coral. It is currently cited as critically endangered under the IUCN Red List. And in the Caribbean, it's been reported as ecologically extinct. So pretty much this means that without human intervention, it is very unlikely that this on its own. However, we have had some pretty good success both in our in situ and our land-based nurseries. They're growing pretty well. And once we outplant them in our different sites, we always keep an eye out on them whenever we visit our sites. And we've had over 80% survival on these Dendrogyra outplants whenever we've had them. There's some colonies that are already fusing, which is pretty nice to see compared to everyone that has seen natural colonies and now they don't see them as healthy. It's pretty cool to go back and see these cement mounds with beautiful fragments growing on them. And another group that started getting some attention have been sponges. Sponges are pretty easy to grow even in the PVC structures. They also help stabilize rubble. They help consolidation of the rubble around them. They filter out the water, so they take a lot of the nutrients and sediments that are floating around the water, and they improve water quality. And to harvest them, it's pretty easy. You just essentially cut out the branches in the PVC tree where they're growing, and you can attach the entire branch on the bottom. The sponges will continue to grow and eventually fuse. And again, a really good complement to have in your restoration projects. Next. So once you identify the species that you want to include in your restoration project and you make sure that the rubble is stabilized and the area is adequate, then you can start undertaking larger restoration projects. One example is the wave attenuation project that we have off the east coast of Puerto Rico in the northern coast of Palomino Island. It was a beach area that was becoming increasingly eroded, especially after hurricane events. And the initial purpose of this project was to outplant at least 5,000 Acropora palmata on the northern coast in hopes to reduce the wave energy hitting this area. We're set for next year to remeasure wave energy in the area to measure the success of this project. As of today, a little bit over than 4,000 of the initial Acropora palmatas are still growing. They're looking pretty good. And we've also, again, collaborated with ICER, outplanted some of their microfragments, and also released a lot of sea urchins and crabs to help us maintain the area. Next. One of our, I would say our largest and more ambitious project by far is the reef renovation in Cayo Largo North and in Cayo Largo South, also off the coast of Fajardo in the East Coast. For this project, it started last year. Our goal was for 3 years, outplant 10,000 corals each year throughout 10,000 square meters of reef at these two cays. Last year, we managed to outplant a little bit over 8,000 corals across those 10 kilometers of reef. And these were distributed across 20 plots. They can be between 15 by 15 meters to 20 by 20 meters, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. And out of those 20 plots, 5 are set out as monitoring plots because you really want to assess the success of your restoration project. Next. For monitoring, similarly to what they're doing in USVI and many other islands, we're using orthomosaics. So we will scan the area with our cameras. We have this program that will stitch all of these thousands of pictures together and give you a high definition image of your plot. The good thing about this methodology is that you can use this as a bucky, right? As a before and after impact. So you can scan your area before you bring in your outplanting. You can do it right after your outplanting, and then you can redo it one more time, a year, 2 years after your outplanting, and then start measuring these biological variables like survival, increases in live tissue, and so on. These are very important metrics, again, to showcase how your restoration projects are doing. Next. And last but not least, during our restoration, during our monitoring, pretty much any time that we go out of the water, we keep an eye out for disease. SCTLD was a huge issue in Florida, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean a couple of years ago. And between Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, we've applied over 10,000 treatments across different sites in both areas. In Puerto Rico, we had the chance to monitor survivability of different colonies, depending on whether they were being treated for SCTLD or no. And we did see a huge difference between the untreated colonies, which could have percent survival as low as 0 to 30%, versus the treated colonies, which had 95 to 100% survival. Well, with that being said, this is the end of my talk. I will take any questions if you have time. If not, we can leave it for later. That's for the panel.
Thank you, Manuel. Appreciate the presentation. And we're going to close out this session with a presentation from Jeremiah on structural complexity and reef fishery and a presentation on Jay, the other Jay, on exactly what I just said. Welcome, Jay.
You sharing the slides? Okay, perfect. All right, so surprise everyone, I'm here instead of Jeremiah. He is the co-author on this presentation. I work for the National Coral Reef Monitoring Program as the fish PI, and I am leaving tomorrow morning now for our first cruise in Florida. So I'm available now to try and talk a little bit about the relationship between structurally complex reefs and reef fishes in the US Caribbean. Next. Is anybody else? Am I frozen? No?
Jay, this is Catherine, there's a little bit of a delay with the slides.
No problem. All right, so the importance of coral reef fishes in the US Caribbean, we heard about it probably best from NOAA Fisheries Assistant Administrator this morning, saying that there's a connection between habitat, the economy, reef fish, it's all connected. And so as far as reef fishes go, they are culturally important, they're economically important either through the fisheries or through ecotourism, all the people that are visiting these wonderful islands to experience the reefs firsthand. and as well as reef fish are really important to the ecosystem. Next. All right, so I stole this slide from the Coral Reef Conservation Program, and I'm not going to go into all the details about it, but just wanted to share, reef fish contribute to the ecosystem in a lot of different ways, whether it's cleaning, reef fish are cleaning one another to keep themselves happy, or cleaning away bits and pieces of the reef so that corals, for restoration efforts, and coral spawning can settle. They are part of nutrient cycling and can also help with pest control. So no one species, especially species that can be detrimental to the coral, can be unchecked. And then the reef also in turn provides shelter for them. Next. So Dr. Shay Viehman, who is the benthic lead in the Atlantic and Caribbean, my counterpart, gave a really, really wonderful overview of NCREMP that I will not go into again since you've already seen it. Just here to highlight again, NCREMP is this nationwide program in the Atlantic and Pacific, and I'm going to be focusing on, of the biological indicators, there's reef fish and benthic, and today I'm focusing on the reef fish section. Next. So NCREMP in the Atlantic and Caribbean, we survey every other year, and we're in the Caribbean in odd years. So this is a snapshot or a glimpse of what sampling looks like in 2025 in both the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Focusing on reef fish, we did about 900 reef fish samples almost. That equates to about almost 1,800 dives, and then over 362,000 individual reef fish were surveyed. That's a lot. And what that looks like is on the right-hand side on these maps. You can see that NCREMP has a good spread of points surrounding each of these island platforms. Next. And we already went in, so the NCREMP has, standardized methods and design and everything. And this is the standardized methods that the reef fish surveys use. They use a stationary point count, and we use the stationary point count to identify, count, and measure fish to the nearest centimeter. And our surveys occur in a fixed, a set area and time so that we're able to roll all these surveys up into abundance indices, which are often used for downstream applications. But I think I'll stop there. I think that's good. That's a good summary there. Next. All right, so using the NCREMP data set, and trying to focus on something that really, really relates to restoration, right? Because this is very connected to restoration, but it's also a pivot from what we were just talking about. So built into the NCREMP survey design, we have this habitat component, which here we're going to use as a proxy for a reef complexity. So we categorized reefs that were highly complex as patch reefs, aggregate reefs, and bedrock, and low complexity reefs as pavement and scatter coral, rock, and sand in the next figures. Next. Again, you can see that, we were talking, the NCREMP data is collected across the Caribbean, the U.S. Caribbean. So I'm going to focus on each of the different regions, but just starting in St. Thomas and St. John, the y-axis here is density, which is the number of individuals within our secondary sampling unit, which are the cylinders that I just showed, and that's our y-axis, and then our x-axis is year, and the lines are structural complexity. So black is high structural complexity, and blue is low structural complexity. And if we choose two species that we know that are reef-associated species, what you can see is that we see more individuals of stoplight parrotfish, a higher density of stoplight parrotfish, and a higher density of three-spot damselfish on reefs that have higher complexity than reefs with low complexity. And I think three-spot damselfish are one of the more annoying species for restoration. So everybody's aware that they are in and around the reef structure. Next. Again, just picking different species to complement to give you a little bit of a variety, looking at French grunt in Puerto Rico and looking at Graysby and St. Croix, same lines, same trends. So what you're seeing here is you have a higher density of French grunt in Puerto Rico and a higher density of Graysby and St. Croix on reefs that have high structural complexity compared to reefs in the same exact region that have low structural complexity. Next. We can also use the NCREM data to look at species richness. So the number of species that we observe in each of the mean number of species that we're observing in each of these second stage units or within the PSU, within our sites. So in Puerto Rico, structural complexity again, high. If it's high structural complexity, we are seeing more species. We're seeing a greater number of individual species in each of our surveys. And in sites that have low structural complexity, we are seeing a fewer number of species at each of these sites. Next. And this same trend holds true in St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. So hopefully this is all driving home that structural complexity is really important for the number of species that are encountered, as far as within each individual species, as well as for the number of species that are encountered. Next. Okay, we always get this question, which I think was still a hangover in the agenda, which is, I'd love to link coral habitat to like fish productivity and fisheries productivity. And it's there, it exists, but it is incredibly complex. And that's because there are fishing regulations that are out there. There are things that occur. You have all these outside factors that really make the relationship convoluted. So showed you using the NCREM data looking at individual species. Some of those are targeted by the fishery and their densities, as well as the number of species. And this is from a model from Unfished Bahamas Reserve. And this model went through and linked the loss of structural complexity to greater than a threefold reduction in fishery productivity. And that is because complex habitats can really influence the survival and growth of reef fish, and they help to mediate predator-prey interactions and competition through prey refugia. So what does that actually mean? It means the figure on the right-hand side. So, if you have more complexity, higher complexity reefs, you're getting larger fish and more fish. And this is because survival. Complexity offers more hiding spots, and perhaps a higher percentage of survival for younger or smaller fish species. Prey for growth. Prey is readily available around the coral reef, so they're not out there swimming, expending a lot of energy trying to track down prey. And versus they're also not trying to consistently swim away from predators. So they're able to focus a little bit more on their growth. To mediate predator-prey interactions, complex habitats can impact a predator's efficiency. So if you're out in the open ocean, the fastest predator can eat an entire school of little fish, where that's not always the case on a reef system, where the fastest predator isn't always winning. So this really helps with the richness that we're talking about. And it helps to mediate and balance that relationship a little bit. And in doing so, it's offering this refugia or a hiding space for prey or these younger life stages of fish where the larger fish can't get to them. They can hide in a small crevice. Next. And we get this one too. Coral cover and reef fishes. So if we're going to restore coral reefs and we're going to increase the amount of coral cover there, we would love to see this really, really beautiful relationship that we increase coral cover and reef fish, increase too, and there's this wonderful relationship. And I'm not saying that there's not a relationship there. I'm saying it's confusing and it's hard. So I think this study probably showed it the best, where there's a meta-analysis of hundreds of studies that reveals a weak but positive correlation between live coral cover and reef fish abundance and richness. And again, it has to do with all these other things that are out of the control of that little study area, whether it's land-based sources of pollution or fishing regulations, or how reef associated this with fishes. So it varies by fish. What's the fish ecological role? Are they a generalist piscivore where they can eat anywhere, or are they really an obligate corallivore? So they are directly associated with the reef. And then keeping in mind fish's life history. Many, many species live a long time. Now, granted, they don't live as long as corals, but some of them are living 10, 20 years, 30. It takes a long time to see change. And fish also have good year classes and bad year classes. And so it could be nothing to do with the restoration site. It could be completely to do with a year class that wasn't great for the fish. So it's just a really complicated relationship. And then also, the relationship with structure is complicated. Next, another image should pop up. But Structural complexity loss takes time. And so this is an image of Florida and Carysport in the top left, where you can see there's a lot of live palmata, there's a lot of structure for fish. Unfortunately, 10 years later, there's a loss of live coral cover, heavy loss of live coral cover, but the structure is somewhat intact for fish. So for a lot of species, this is still okay. It's not okay for all of them, but it's for a lot of species, this is still okay, which is why this relationship gets very confusing. And then, in 2004, you're starting to see that breakdown of the structural complexity. And then in 2014, so 40 years later, that's when you really see what we probably will classify this as a low complexity site. So it takes a long time, and that's for branching species, which happens a lot faster than bouldering species. So it's just a little bit more complicated than I think we would like it to be. Next. All right, and so this is what Shay covered really well, so I'm just going to ping on it, and just a friendly reminder that NCREMP data, I'm talking about Reef fish here, but all the NCREMP data are publicly available. They are long-term monitoring data, and that's really, especially with fish, with anything, but especially with fish, you need to be able to detect changes because they have these boom and bust years naturally. The data sets available to inform ecosystem, fisheries, ESA, and invasive species, as well as restoration. And Shay gave the example of mission iconic reefs, looking at restoration. And so this is a way to leverage or build upon the NCREMP data set. NCREMP is there. We're going to collect all the information on the outside, and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and the mission iconic reefs has decided to put forth money to survey inside the restoration areas so that we can look at benthic and fish inside these restoration areas and compare it to the outside reef to really see what this is doing to change each of these populations. Next. And to kind of bring it full circle, bring it back around, the NCREMP survey design has always incorporated the strong relationship between habitat complexity and reef fish. We've done it qualitatively, which is what I presented on here by habitat type. And in 2027, we're going to roll out a new and improved sampling design that will quantitatively include the relationship between relief and coral reef fish. And we hope that this is going to help improve our estimates because, as you know, all pavement sites don't look the same. And all patch reefs don't look the same. And what we found is that really it's how fish view it is more quantitative. It's not what our eyes are seeing or trying to classify it in a qualitative way. So we're going to roll that out in our next sampling season. Next. And to wrap up what everybody has said, nothing can be done alone. Nothing. Especially surveying corals or restoration efforts with corals, whether it's this reef fish, which I focus on. These are some of the NCREMP partners from the CRCP funded project, and we are immensely grateful for everybody that comes together to be able to produce this valuable data set that you can use for any of the downstream applications or build upon as well. Next. And with that, I'm not sure if we even have time for questions, but this is my wrap-up slide. And this was a reef in St. Croix this past year. Not the healthiest coral, but the fish are there. Kind of wrapping up and proving my point, but hopefully we can get some coral restoration here and make this site look beautiful on the benthic side and the fish side.
Thank you so much, Jay, for another amazing presentation in our day. If you have questions, please feel free to add them to the chat, and presenters, if you can respond to questions directly in the chat, that would be great, and allow us to pivot to our next session, which is on focus on the heating events that we've seen in the last few years. And so the first presenter, we have three presenters or panelists for this session. Manuel Nieves, who you just heard of with SeaVentures, Marilyn Brandt from the University of the Virgin Islands, who you also just heard from, and we have joining them Cailtin Lustic from the Nature Conservancy, who's based currently in the U.S. Virgin Islands, but has been in the field for as long as I have, as we work together with the Nature Conservancy. When she was based in Florida and I was based in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so welcome to the three of you. We're going to start with a brief intro from each panelists. So we'll have Manuel present first, and he has a few slides to share with the team.
So should I share directly from my screen?
No, next slide, please.
Hey, Manuel, this is Catherine. I'm just getting your slides pulled
Okay.
up. Just give me 1 second.
So for the panel, it should start the same presentation, slide number 13. There you go. Thank you very much. So thanks again. My name is Manuel Nieves. I'm working with SeaVentures. As for our bleaching response for 2023, you can go ahead and click next. Well, one of the first things that we could do now that we have the land-based nurseries, the water's getting too warm, take them out of the water. If you do have the facility for the ex-situ nurseries, the water there, they can keep it in the best conditions possible. So one of our first strategies to respond to bleaching was just remove the corals, especially if they were not doing well in the in-situ nurseries, bring them to the ex-situ nurseries and start preparing for genotype banking. So we have this idea that the genotypes that we're working with are the ones that have been surviving the bleaching events in the past. So hopefully they are more resistant to the upcoming warming on the ocean. So we do want to keep these genotypes in stock and continue them under control conditions. Another strategy that we could do pretty quick in our field was just moving the nursery structures, the in-situ structures, a little bit deeper in the water, hopefully to avoid a little bit more of the thermal stress and the light stress that the corals can become exposed to during these heating events. And last but not least, we also incorporated, there's a bunch of different types of use in your nurseries. One of them is the one shown in the picture on the left. We call this the swings. And then those trays that are holding the corals, you can see a close-up picture on the right. They serve, like the upper trays will shade the one under and so on. And it was pretty impressive going out during these bleaching events and swimming around these nurseries and seeing actually the ones that were on the topmost tray, they looked stressed, they looked bleached, and then the ones that were on the lower trays, they looked much better, and some of them didn't even show bleaching stress. So relatively simple strategies that could go a long way in face of these bleaching events. Next. During 2023 and no, wait, what? It should go into a Puerto Rico map. Is that the last slide?
Hold on, Manuel. Let me just double check.
If not, if there's a way that I can show my screen, I have it set up here. Okay, here we go. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Yes, all right. So this is some of Puerto Rico showing mortality rates after the 2023-2024 bleaching events. As you can see, the northern coast, the south coast, and the island of Vieques showing the southeast. They experienced a higher mortality rates around the island when compared to the west coast, some of the areas on the east coast close to Fajardo, and where we have a lot of our restoration projects. So following up on this map, we identified the areas that were less affected by these bleaching events, and we set those areas up as donor sources to conduct projects on assisted gene flow. So the idea is to take from these red dots, you see Mona Island on the west coast, you see this red square on the east coast, this is Fajardo, Palomino, and these again were the areas that had less mortality rates, and we started bringing corals from these areas into the corals on the southwest in La Parguera, close to Guanica, hopefully to bring some of these more resilient genotypes into these highly affected areas and help try again and expand the geographical extent of the corals. So as further preparation, as we prepare for this year and the coming years bleaching, we started adjusting some of our efforts. So initially we had planned large outplanting efforts on the south. And after that huge bleaching event, we saw the south was maybe not the best area to outplant all of these corals. So we ended up switching to the east coast where there's usually better water flow and the corals have greater chance of survival. We are continuing our assisted gene flow efforts. Currently, we're collaborating with Jennifer Moore to collect 50 fragments, 50 fragments from each coast for a total of 200 fragments, again, as an effort to create a biobank of resistant genotypes. We're rushing to complete this work before the summer ends and hopefully before the serious bleaching, the serious heating begins. And after collecting these areas, we're going to send them to sequence so that we can start identifying the genotypes at the metagenomic level. And thank you again for your attention. These are some of our collaborators. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Now we'll hear briefly from Marilyn.
Let me finish. Okay, yeah.
Okay, well, I put a couple of other slides in there, but yeah, I brought this up earlier. We had the mass coral bleaching events in 2023 and 2024. 2023 was really intense, and we actually had the most bleaching was seen on the orbicelids. And then 2024 was, we actually in 2023, the acroporids did okay. And then in 2024, that's sort of what wiped out a lot of the acroporids. And I had a couple of other slides. I don't know, Catherine, if you're,
Marilyn,
you have those.
that was the only one that we had there.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
I have them, so I can just talk. The strategies that we had. Let me see if I can bring that up. Sorry about that. So yeah, the strategies that we've used are similar to what Manuel was talking about. Let me get this up. Sorry for the difficulties. I don't know. I think screen 2. Sorry, folks. I'll be quick after that, I promise. Okay. Can you all see the presenter? Or the? Yes. Okay, great. So just strategies we also have on our land-based system. We've added kind of a giant chiller that you can see on the right-hand side. And that keeps the seawater, even though it's large, we put it, it still can really only keep the seawater temperatures at or just below the bleaching threshold. And that we added that chiller in 2024. And so that was able to, we were kind of able to manage the temperatures in the land-based system. And then other strategies we used in 2023 and 2024 were basically evacuating the trees that we have to deeper waters. The temperatures, though, in the Virgin Islands, the thermal stress really extended all the way into the deep. There wasn't any significant difference in temperatures between the shallow areas and the deep. So this was really any anything that was moderating the temperature stress really had mostly to do with light and flow. Since we are an academic research institution, we are implementing strategies to respond to thermal stress, but we're also trying to do some research to understand how the corals are reacting and what other strategies might be working. So in 2023, 2024, we did several different projects, including a deep outplanting project. So that's on the upper left. That is a Cropper cervicornis outplanted to 120 feet. So this required rebreathers. This was led by Sonora Miling. And we found that there was kind of a sweet spot in terms of outplanting down to 80 feet. Again, the temperatures were all the same, down to 120 feet. But there was kind of a mid-range where the corals did a lot better at 80 feet. We're actually processing those corals to understand what was going on physiologically. We also did some heat hardening experiments. I mentioned this. That was part of Khadisha Tong's undergraduate project, but we also did a heat hardening project run by my technicians, Rachel Iannata and Brad Arrington. And the short story there is that Orbicilla did well after heat hardening. So that's where in the land-based system, we intentionally bleached them, but fed them. And then when they were put out during the thermal stress season in 2024, they did not show as much bleaching and actually showed growth earlier. Khadisha's project tested Acropora for that, and the short story there is that Acropora does not like to be heat hardened. They were very sensitive, and so they did not do well. But we're continuing to track those corals. We also had a project where we fed the corals during bleaching. That kind of happened really quickly in 2023. So we fed them like we do in the seawater tables. We put bags over them and let them be exposed to the coral food for about an hour, and that did not seem to have any significant effects. It was also extremely laborious, so I don't recommend the coral feeding. We've also been doing fate tracking with some symbiont physiological sampling, determine for the corals that bleach less, what are their physiological states? Do they have certain symbiont communities? It did seem that the north side corals did not switch over to clade to Durastinium like many of the south side corals did, so that there are sort of indicators of physiological changes related to physical or related to the environment. And then again, we're testing the trace metal supplements. Some we're just putting out because we know they work, and then we're testing additional ones. So that's some of the research. So that was it. Thank you. I don't know how to unshare. Oh,
Thank
okay.
you, Marilyn.
Got it.
I appreciate it, and sorry for the technical issues there.
Nope.
And then third up, we'll hear from Cailtin Lustic from the Nature Conservancy in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Thanks, Kemit. Are you sharing my slides? Yeah, okay. Okay, so in 2023, they sort of had the benefit here of having learned from what was happening in Florida. So much of the nursery stock was evacuated to land, to our land-based systems here at the Coral Innovation Hub, where we could control temperature and keep them safe during the bleaching event. We did in 2023 begin to more intentionally gene bank everything in our stock. So now we have within our production stock, we also have everything gene banked, so that even while we're producing for restoration purposes, we still have things that stay here. Some of the field-based colonies were not able to be brought to land. So like some of them were attached to domes, they were zip tied. It would have been really difficult to move those corals. So we trialed some shading on some of the nursery structures. And then there also just happened to be drone monitoring that was happening before bleaching. And so that ended up providing us with a really good baseline to use to document changes over time at a relatively large reef scale. And then in 2024, the team also reviewed the lessons learned document that Florida had put together in 2023 and worked to identify triggers at which certain interventions would be applied. And then also in 2024, they trialed taking the boards of corals, so that's the picture you see there, and just securing those upside down under the tables to help decrease solar irradiance. And this worked really well until the water just got too hot for them to survive anyways. It is important if you're trialing that method to think about what kind of substrate they're on, because white sand will reflect the light and not provide as much relief as other types of substrate. Next slide, please. So then during bleaching, we continued to conduct both in-water structure for motion bleaching surveys and drone monitoring. And by pairing those, the in-water surveys allowed us to assess the impacts and resilience at a finer scale across a wider range of species and at sites that were deeper than the drone allowed, while the drone mapping allows us to look at much larger areas, identify patterns related to which of those areas may or may not be bleaching. And then for certain species, we can track survivorship of individuals. So you can see there just a section of reef that shows alcorn corals, both bleached and unbleached. So there is enough resolution with certain species in shallow enough water to be able to tell the fate of those individuals. And so using this sort of paired information from both the drone and in-situ monitoring, we can start to think about future areas where, specifically in this picture, where elkhorn restoration might be more successful. And then we've also begun sampling from the individuals that survived to have represented in our gene bank and also to continue to propagate for future restoration efforts. We also, during the bleaching, halted outplanting and fragmenting of the corals that remained in the field. So just really focusing on monitoring and cleaning and maintenance. And then finally, until it got too hot, the team was monitoring the field nursery corals to see if there was any differential survivorship with those different sort of trial methods of shading versus flipping the boards under the tables. Next slide. And then after bleaching, we've again continued both that in situ and drone monitoring to document changes over time. Most of our stock is still in the land-based nursery, but we are thinking about how to most effectively pair the field and land nurseries moving forward, with that understanding that we're going to continue to face bleaching events in the future. So thinking about how to plan for that. One of the things we're thinking about doing is building some paired nurseries where there's a nursery in, say, 20 to 30 feet and then another one in 50 to 60 feet. So the corals could potentially be moved deeper during times of heat stress. We're working to incorporate more sexual propagation into the program to increase genetic diversity using parents from the field that survived past bleaching events. And then we're also incorporating some more novel techniques, such as settling larvae and growing juveniles in warmer temperatures. Our corals, we generally now fuse colonies on substrates in the lab so that they're either of reproductive size or very close when they're outplanted. And the goal there is that they would be contributing to population recovery more quickly than if we put them out at much smaller sizes, where it would take a couple of years for them to reach that size of reproductive maturity. We're also planning to bring in some corals from Florida. And we would hopefully lay the groundwork for more regional swaps of larvae and adults in the future. And that's it.
Thank you, Cailtin, and I will invite the others, Manuel, Marilyn, and Cailtin, to turn cameras on, and we have a few questions that we'd like to pose to you about the heating events in the last few years. So the first question is, what tools do you use to plan during the summer events, primarily around bleaching?
Like, I think Coral Reef Watch is the primary thing that we're keeping an eye on. Sorry, my internet's lagging. That and any presentations that Coral Reef Watch gives out, or any like warnings or anything. So that's our primary one that I can think of.
Cool.
I would just say this isn't necessarily a tool, but also just like being regionally connected. And like, I think that stone coral tissue loss disease really built these networks that didn't exist as cohesively before these events. So like us learning from Florida and also learning from just regional networks that I think are much stronger now than they were before we started experiencing these more frequent disturbances.
In our case, we also keeping an eye out on the Coral Reef Watch website to monitor the degree heating weeks. But we also have the Caricus. They have buoys deployed around Puerto Rico that give us a closer look throughout around the island. Caricus.org, pretty good tool to have. And also we've installed the SOFAR buoys in Cayo Largo North and Cayo Largo South, which were our largest restoration sites on the East Coast. They also give us a closer look into what the physics of the water are looking like in that area, the temperature, the currents, what they're doing. And something we've done in the past, I think we still have some hobos attached to our in situ nurseries. So it's, again, relatively cost-effective way to kind of like track what has happened in your nurseries, in your in situ nurseries through time. That's it.
Thanks, Manuel. And you've all shared some of the things that you've done during previous bleaching events. But I was curious to know how, if they have, how have your restoration priorities and or strategies changed since the last few bleaching events? I know, Marilyn, you mentioned some trials with deeper restoration sites and whatnot, but I don't know if that's been baked into like this. These are some results that we've seen that we like that we want to build into how we approach coral restoration moving forward.
Yeah, we haven't, they're not completely baked yet into it, but there are certainly plans like evacuating the coral trees. We've now done that before, and so we know how to do it. And in our more recent Army Corps nursery permit, we are hoping to put in more of these like deeper secondary nursery locations where we can just move some of the trees during these heat events. You know, a lot of the thermal stress is also happening at the same time as hurricane season. So some of the strategies, we're always thinking as well about how this is going to be impacted by the hurricanes. So moving some of these structures deeper would also be a good thing for storm season. So we're actually considering doing things like moving the nurseries deeper annually anyway, just in preparation for storm season, like lightening them up and then moving them deeper to keep them out of kind of that storm zone area. I would say also, I wanted to just also second Manuel's note about Caricus. We do use those buoys, and like any other types of live data we're using. And then, yeah, as Cailtin mentioned, using kind of the VI Rocks network to share communications. We do in the Virgin Islands have this trigger with the Virgin Islands Coral Disturbance Advisory Committee, where if it gets to be a certain amount or a certain temperature stress, we start to initiate additional meetings to discuss bleaching responses for the territory. That I think we used and we didn't use. I think it's still a good strategy to just have that increased communication during these events, because some people will see everybody's really busy, but it's a good way to say, okay, well, we're not seeing anything in these certain habitats, but we are in other habitats. So maybe you need to keep an eye on that specific habitat. So increased communication is definitely something that is hard to maintain during these events, but can be really critical. So.
Anyone else on how strategies may have changed or priorities since?
In our case, we initially had the project that we started in a large project that we started in Fajardo initially was, I understand, was supposed to go into Guanica, into the south, which was severely impacted during the 2023-2024 bleaching events. And again, just following on that, we decided that it might not be the best idea to start bringing hundreds and thousands of corals into this area, because they probably had a high chance of being affected. So instead of taking corals into where we know they are done, decided to reinforce the areas that are still surviving, if that makes sense. So that was one of the ways that we kind of like shifted our attention and our initial idea of what our restoration was going to look like. And again, just some other strategies, like again, like moving into deeper waters, taking the corals out into the land-based nurseries, especially with Dendrogyra. I've been speaking with people that we need to start seeing Dendrogyra with the same intensity that we see pandas. You talk about endangered species, and everyone has an idea of the panda bear, but not necessarily with corals. And Dendrogyra has sadly reached that spot where we need to give it the best conditions that we can give it, and it seems that now it looks like a lot of that means going into the land-based nurseries and biobanking.
Yeah, I would just say, oh, sorry, go ahead,
Go
Kemit.
ahead.
Gene banking for sure is something I think we're being more strategic about, is making sure, especially for the species that have been really heavily affected, like elkhorn, trying to make sure that we know what's left and that we have it gene banked. But then also, I think, we were always doing some monitoring, but really like letting the corals tell us where they are surviving better and which genotypes are doing better, and sort of leaning into that, understanding there might be sites that just get too much hot water, and that's not going to be a good place for corals in the future. And so I think thinking strategically about how to use our monitoring to better inform where and how we do restoration is really important. But yes, gene banking for sure as well.
I was gonna say, Manuel, it sounds like that your thoughts tee up a really cool social media activity that we should tap into our you presenters from earlier to create a campaign around Dendrogyras that look like pandas. I mean, they're fuzzy enough, so we could probably make something really, really attractive for knowledge sharing. I'll write a note down for that. The next question is one that has been asked by a number of people. And as I ask these questions, feel free. I see a few in the chat that I will get to shortly. Feel free to add any additional questions that you have for our panelists in the chat. But one of the things that I've been asked from many people is what, if anything, can be done on a natural reef during a bleaching event. I've heard about instances in Dominica, for example, where there is one coral that was super famous and needed and productive, and there were efforts done to try to protect as much as they could that one individual. But from your perspective, is there anything that could be done at any meaningful scale on a natural reef during a bleaching event?
Go ahead, Manuel.
From my perspective, any way that we can increase resilience around the island, around the area, I think that would be the way to go. In that sense, we can repopulate the area with corals that we know that are, especially using assisted gene flow. So if we're doing biobanking, it's not only to have a record and an inventory of heat-resistant genotypes. We eventually want to use these, right? We don't want to just keep them in stock. So start bringing in these more resistant genotypes to complement the natural areas. Hopefully they'll help increase resilience in the area. and also continue their work with herbivores that ICER is doing with sea urchins and crabs. We can go and maintain the area. We can go and clean out some of the algae, but the ones that are actually living there and visiting the area every day would be the sea urchins and the crabs and the herbivores that are actually keeping the algae in check and allowing the corals to continue colonizing space. And in the case where you see, again, I stress out a lot of the importance of controlling rubble. Rubble it's a natural process, but if left unchecked, it does take a long time for rubble to naturally stabilize. So if you are, for any reason, you swim around a natural reef area, you see that there's a problem with rubble, you know that if you don't do something with that rubble, the next hurricane is gonna bulldoze that entire area. Those little fragments are gonna start rolling up and down. So yeah, just as a general summary, increase resilience in the area by including thermally resistant corals, including herbivores to help maintain the area, and just make the area as habitable as you can for corals to continue to grow.
I was going to add it so that I was mentioning before, when their thermal stress gets high, it triggers kind of these additional meetings of the Virgin Islands Coral Disturbance Advisory Committee. And one of the things that we've done in the past is also get together to release a press release to the public about a bleaching event. I don't know if that actually went out in 2024 because DPNR was having issues with, like, the communications department had to review it or something. But in the press release, we explain what's going on to the community so that people know it's a stressful event for the corals and to take care around the corals, maybe have a little bit more extra sensitivity. Yeah, it's more, I remember it didn't go out. Anyway, the goal is to communicate more with the community. And so we also, this can be done through everybody's social media posts and things. Just say, hey, take care. It looks pretty when the corals are white, but it's actually not a good thing. And just explaining the stress about it, and then communicating to us if they're seeing mass bleaching. I've heard of folks doing things like closing off sensitive areas, but I feel like that kind of backfires if you're preventing people from going into an area that without their consultation. I think that may not be a great way of protecting a reef, but just communicating what's going on and having people take care around. I've also heard of folks shading specific areas. So those are kind of direct methods, like what Manuel was explaining too. I've also heard that a group in the Hawaii Pacific, so Andrew Gratoli, has developed like a light that will stay on all night that will help feed the corals. That can also backfire because it can attract other things. So, there's these direct activities, but I think right now one of the most effective strategies is to just communicate what's going on, and so that people take care around the corals. And I think that's something management communities should think about, that if there's a bleaching event predicted or going on, that if there's permitted work to work with corals or around corals, that perhaps those permits should come with the caveat that if there's severe bleaching, that the work needs to be postponed, or so that if there's work going on during that time, it's sensitive to the corals. This could also be the case for, I don't even know if this is possible, but like construction projects, like maybe don't dredge during mass bleaching events so that we don't have another disease event happen or something like that. So thinking about it at the larger management context of how to communicate with the community, but also with activities that are happening on land or in the marine environment that could be stressing the corals out even more.
Thank you, Marilyn. Cailtin, I'll apologize for this in advance because I did not plan to ask you this question, but given the work that you've done with the Reef Resilience Network in Florida, what are some of the things that you you think would be beautiful to see replicated in the Virgin Islands, if any?
Sorry, you cut out for me there at the end. You're asking with Florida's
reef resilience work that you've done, what might be
in Florida
things to replicate or to introduce to the USVI? Maybe that haven't been introduced, or what are some of the things that are happening in both places?
I mean, from my perspective, I think a lot of the things that have been happening in Florida are already happening here. Like I said, I think the coordination has increased so much, and that happened in Florida too, around stony coral tissue loss disease. But I think a lot of I mean, luckily, I guess for the Caribbean, you usually have a little heads up from Florida before these things happen. So, being able to come at these problems with a little bit more information in your hands rather than Florida's usually a little bit more scrambling to figure out what some potential solutions are. So I think the key is really like staying in tune with what is happening in Florida and knowing like sort of the advancements that are happening there, which I think is happening well with like the VI Rocks group. And I think there's many people in the Caribbean that work pretty closely with partners in Florida too. So we stay pretty connected to that work. But I can't think of anything that's happening in Florida that isn't necessarily happening here. I think one thing that's a little harder in the Caribbean, and really Florida should be involved in this too, but in terms of gene banking and like mixing genetics, because the Caribbean is so many different jurisdictions, so that's like a pretty complicated situation of moving corals or juveniles or larvae or whatever it is between different jurisdictions. But I think that's going to be something really important in the future as these corals population sizes continue to decline, is to make sure that we're mixing genetic diversity so that we're not ending up in these genetic bottlenecks in individual places. So that'll take a lot of regional coordination and like maybe even at a different level, because I think right now it's more happening. Well, I guess not. There's definitely management agencies involved as well, but like across different jurisdictions of management agencies thinking about how to both gene bank and mix genetic variation across boundaries.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to pull on one of the questions from the chat, and it kind of like ties in beautifully with one of the questions that I had prepared. What do you anticipate for 2026? And are there signs that we might be going into yet another bleaching event?
I can start. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. So we're going to freeze the ocean. No.
That's what I'm probably going to say fingers crossed too.
I think Cailtin did mention that she was having some technical issues. So Marilyn, do you want to?
Sure, I'm happy to go back to her when she gets on. But yeah, I agree with Cailtin, fingers crossed. We were told by NOAA Coral Reef Watch that to expect a bad year because of this super El Nino and just things are heating up. We're not super hot yet here in the Virgin Islands, but I think it's headed that direction. So I think we're preparing for the worst and hoping for the best because, you know, we did hit 22-degree heating weeks here in 2024, and that was insane. And that heat stress started now or this time of year. So I'm hopeful we're not going to hit that level, really like knock on wood. Oh my gosh. Yes. Thanks, Kemit. And that these corals have seen that temperature stress. So obviously there is a lot of variability among sites. But I am maybe hopeful that we've seen that bad stress in 2024, that maybe they can withstand it this year. So yeah, we're preparing obviously for the worst, but hoping for the best. Wrapping it up and giving it back to Cailin, who's back.
Yeah, all I was going to say was that I'm more worried about 2027 if the heat stress persists that long. But yes, obviously we do need to be prepared because it is hard to predict how things will affect different areas. We did have a significant jump in water temperature recently that has everybody a little bit on edge.
In our case, I completely agree with Marilyn. We hope for the best, but we prepare for the worst. Hopefully it won't come to that, but yeah, just as a proactive strategy, we will push for our gene banking before the heating, the serious heating starts. We're gonna continue a plan to harvest around 50 genotypes from each coast in Puerto Rico, so north, south, east, and west. Hopefully have a gene bank starting at 200 different genotypes that we can have in stock and just continue producing in our land-based nurseries while the environment itself gets a little bit cooler for start getting them back.
Cool, thank you. And I know this panel is on bleaching events and how you respond to it. But what other natural events do you respond to, and how? I know, Marilyn, you mentioned the I guess double whammy of the bleaching season also coinciding with hurricane season. But are there and some of you have mentioned stony coral tissue loss disease response, but what are the I guess the big drivers in terms of natural events that we notwithstanding all of the anthropogenic impacts to corals out there, but what other natural events do you respond to regularly?
So the hurricane season is a big one, but honestly, if you're talking about corals evolved in the hurricane belt. So we've seen much bigger impacts from bleaching and disease emergence than we have from hurricanes, although I don't want to say that to the universe, but we've had enough big hurricanes, so thanks. But other things that we respond to are boat groundings and anchor damage, and kind of these acute small impacts. It's generally small in area. They're not affecting the whole region, but they can have significant impacts. Like we had one yacht come in and anchor in Brewers Bay, and Brewers Bay had one really beautiful intact reef, and it did an enormous amount of damage. And so we've gone out and taken some of those corals and the large ones and moved them. SeaVentures, I'm not sure if you guys were part of that too, but so we definitely do responding to these boat groundings and impacts in that sense. And then the next thing has been invasive species that we've dealt with. So we at the university has done studies in response to the lionfish invasion. We've also done studies in response to the seagrass invasion, and we have some small funding to do surveillance for the potential invasion of the pulse coral. So those are more of the things that we're not, expecting constantly, but they do occasionally happen. And, you need to think about, okay, how would we respond to them?
Caitlin or Manuel?
Well, in our case, we also similarly respond to vessel groundings. We prepare for the winter swells, the hurricanes. A couple of years ago, we even had earthquakes hitting particularly hard the south coast of Puerto Rico. We are in a transition belt, so they're not super common, but that year they were exceptionally active. Huge cracks form in the seafloor. A lot of houses got completely destroyed. So we did go out to again check out a lot of the rubble that started being produced, and uh, it is again it's yeah. Rubble, I feel like it's one of those things that if the conditions are right, you can go out and help stabilize some of this rubble so that it just doesn't continue creating damage around. But yeah, I would say that the stressors that we're exposed to are pretty similar to what Marilyn mentioned. And also, of course, like disease, keeping an eye out for SCTOD and all diseases.
Thanks, Manuel. Fee, you had a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I finally made it to my whiz. So I have a question about more the physical science side, and it's been really great to get this perspective from a biological side. But I'm wondering, how much do you all interact with people on the physical oceanography side to do things like, like look at seasonal forecasts of ocean temperature or bottom temperature, surface temperature, these kinds of things, and then how much are you interacting with the meteorological community to look at like wind stress and these types of things?
Can take that first. So we definitely communicate directly with the folks at Coral Reef Watch for the satellite data and what they think, and and that's not just attending the presentations; it is, directly communicating with them. At all of our sites, we also have hobo loggers, so we're recording the temperatures across the seascape. So that's usually post-processing, though. We don't know until afterwards. At UVI, we have the capability to deploy gliders. So that's Doug Wilson. So he communicates back kind of oceanographic conditions. We also work with hydrodynamicists like Gordon Zhang at Woods Hole to look at general current flows, but that's not usually predictive. It's usually post-processing to see like how some of those oceanographic conditions affected or may have influenced the responses. And then I think we mentioned before, like the Carrie Coos buoys, we definitely keep an eye on them. And yes, Jillian put in the chat that the Argo floats are being deployed off the Germanic Bank this week to get the profiles. So we generally work, or we have oceanographers at UVI that, not actually at UVI, but who are associated with UVI, who we do communicate with in as many predictive ways as possible. But a lot of this stuff is processed after the fact.
Thanks, Marilyn.
Yeah, I would say same. We're mostly using Coral Reef Watch, and then we had some SOFAR buoys. They're down right now, but those can be really useful for getting real-time information of sort of surface temperature and bottom temperature. I think even wave action. So I think our hope is to get those back up at some point. But we do also have temp loggers places. So, but again, post, that would be like we know what the temperatures were after.
In our case, similar to Marilyn and Cailin, we use, whatever resources are out there as open source that we can just log in, look at the NOAA or Reef Watch, see how the temperature patterns are looking. Carrie Coos gives us pretty good information about sites close to the coast. And again, we also deployed some oceanographic buoys literally like just a couple of meters away from our restoration sites so that we could have just a closer look into what the conditions are looking at that area. The project that we do have, I would say, closer communication with physical oceanographers would be wave attenuation, because of course we are measuring the change in wave energy hitting the area before and after the the restoration project. So I would say that that's the one that we do have direct communication with physical, but on the other hand, we just pay attention to the, whatever buoys can give us the information that we need before we go out and do any type of field work.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that it's like pretty much after the fact and or like during whatever is happening. So I just want to highlight an initiative at NOAA called the Changing Ecosystems and Fisheries Initiative. And they're creating seasonal forecasts for the Caribbean and Northeast Atlantic, where you can see, what the temperatures or wave actions is going to be like throughout the whole season. It's using really high resolution ocean models. So if you're interested in accessing any of those products, please reach out and I could connect you up with the people who runs that.
Yes, that sounds great.
Thanks,
If I
Fee.
could add to something that Manuel said,
I have one more question for you. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge Edwin's comment in the chat. Feel free to take a look. Essentially, reiterating that it's more than just one thing. As with everything that we deal with, if you've worked for any bit of time in the coral world, you understand that there are so many things, and I am taken back by I think the long list of things that Marilyn rattled off in terms of other things that they respond to, and that the reality that you do X amount in coral restoration and you get to a comfortable place and there's yet something else to then begin to study and learn how to adapt to. Before the last question, Sean from SeaVentures would like to add something, and then we'll wrap up this.
Oh, hey, thanks, Kemit. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so about that,
Yes.
the wave attenuation side, I wanted to add something that we worked with
Sean?
Miguel Canals from University of Puerto Rico, who's an oceanographer there, and he actually designed the outplanting, like what depth, how big,
Sean sneezes.
stuff like that.
Sean loses.
Can you hear me?
So we might.
I
There
can
might
hear
be a
him. It's
connection
just
issue.
really faint.
Sean's trying to.
Yeah.
I was just trying to say, can you hear me any better now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. No, I was just trying to say that the wave attenuation.
Then you're talking about year 1, 2, 3, 4. So then
Hold on 1 second, Sean. If you're not speaking, can you mute your? Thank you. Yes, Sean.
Yeah, so we had used a physical oceanographer from the University of Puerto Rico, Miguel Canals, to actually design the outplanting site for the wave attenuation site. So that was prior to outplanting. This was another actual project with NOAA and the Restoration Center, where they kind of decide what would be the optimal depths and stuff to try to, increase wave attenuation over time. And so that was working with the oceanographers before the outplanting to try to maximize the wave attenuation over time.
Nice. Thanks, Sean. So one last question, 4 minutes left in this session. What keeps you up at night? I know, right? All the work, the effort that we have put into keeping corals alive, bringing corals back, focusing in these areas that we understand are important, and so we label them as a priority site. And as we mentioned, there's all of these external factors that we have zero control over in an ocean that's super connected. What, if anything, keeps you up at night when you think about your work?
I guess I'll go first. So what keeps me up at night is the political situation and the will to do something about climate change in the world. I think there's a lot of people who are working very hard to advocate to reduce, impacts that result in climate change. So, but there is also this kind of money-driven culture. I mean, maybe I'm feeling it mostly in the US at the moment, but there's a lot of strong headwinds against trying to prevent more climate change. What helps me sleep at night, though, which I think is actually maybe a way that we should end this session, is that, again, there are a lot of people who are doing a lot of positive things to combat climate change, because that is a really primary driver of coral decline. There are a lot of people like, people on this panel who are working hard to improve coral restoration outcomes and do the best and communicate that to the community. So the other things that help me sleep are the students that I work with and the younger generation who you've heard from today, who they have even new, better new ideas than my generation, who are going to be working really hard to restore these reefs and conserve them for the future. So that's my ending on a high note.
Anyone else? What allows you to sleep?
Oh, I was going to do what keeps me up.
Your call, Cailtin.
I was just going to say something that keeps me up is thinking about, and I think we all struggle with this, like how to fund programs that are long-term, and we know they're going to be long-term, and we also need to be super adaptive because things are always changing. And so, we put together a funding proposal for 4 years, and it has certain deliverables, and then suddenly we have a disease we didn't anticipate or something, and that becomes the most important priority. And so figuring out how to have funding that keeps the lights on, that does all the things, but it's also flexible enough that we can be addressing the most pressing need at any given moment. Think about that a lot. And thank you to NOAA for often being that funder.
And what allows you to sleep then?
I mean, I was in Florida for 15 years before I came here, and I really feel like in my time there, we being the royal we, like the restoration community, faced so many challenges. And we haven't solved the problems necessarily, but I think the community has really come together in a way that we weren't in the beginning. And also, I've seen really big changes in the way we're thinking about things, like being more proactive about gene banking and moving genetics across regions, and things even like the big coral rescue in Florida would not have been something we discussed when I started my career, and now it's something that it was completely necessary, and I think it's changed the way we think about what we need to do moving forward. So I think there's a lot of really smart people working on these problems, and it's great to be part of that community, and so that gives me hope.
Thanks, Cailtin. We are just over time, but Manuel, if you have any last words, welcome them.
For me, it's a matter of we know what the problems are. We know what the issues are. We have in our hands a lot of really good restoration tools that over the years I've seen that slowly they've improved. It's impressive to see these restoration projects where you see a flattened out area, and then implementing some of these strategies, you can get thousands of corals back into an area, and it's inspiring to see these bounce back whenever the restoration projects have some sort of success. It does stress me out, that our main issue is climate change, and we can continue putting as many corals as we can out there, but unless the root problem is addressed, we got to think about how far can we take these efforts. That's also why I do get excited about all of these projects that are being showcased around the world, where they're actually taking CO2 directly from the atmosphere to start reducing climate change as much as we can. So those are some of the slivers of hope that help me sleep at night, considering all the. But it's inspiring to see again young people taking all of these new tools and putting them into practice and seeing a lot of the success stories that everyone has had, and just lucky to be part of this process.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you again to Manuel, Marilyn, and Cailtin for another really good panel. I will sleep well tonight. Thank you for sharing that with me, Marilyn. A former boss once shared we're gonna start to feed two birds with one stone line as opposed to what was previously used, and I love that we can do exactly what we're doing in our work, try to turn a negative into a positive. So thank you again for joining us on the panel today. We will take a quick break. I'm going to kick it back over to Jillian. We're going to, I think, do a quick break, and then we have one more session for this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks so much, all. And Kemit, we'll take a quick 15-minute break, and then we'll join